Well, last week we began a series that I'm calling Responding to the Resurrection, where we're looking at some of the post-resurrection accounts of Jesus and his followers and their responses to the risen Jesus. Last week we looked at the whole Mary and her response when she went to the tomb and encountered Jesus, who she thought was the gardener. And we looked at Peter and his response last week when he and John went running to the tomb to discover that it was empty. We looked at Thomas and his response when Jesus showed up behind locked, closed doors, and Thomas was able to put his finger in the spear wound in Jesus' side, and his response. And at the end of all of that, I asked you, what is your response to the resurrection? And so today we want to look at another post-resurrection account. This one particularly focuses with Peter again, and we'll look at Peter's response to it and kind of look at our own alongside of Peter's. Today's passage has long been a favorite of mine. I've loved this passage for years and years and years. In fact, this passage is the very passage that 19 years ago, God used this passage to convict Pastor Sharon and I that we wanted to come here to be your pastors. 19 years ago through this passage. We had interviewed with a small group of then Salisbury Community Church of the Brethren, now known as Community of Joy. We had interviewed with a small group from among here, and we had felt like that interview went okay. We thought we blew them out of the water and that they really weren't going to be interested in inviting us to come here because we had some far-fetched ideas and we were going to push the envelope of what church is and how we do church. And when they called us and said, hey, we really want you to come and be our pastors, we said, whoa, wait a minute here. We think we need to have a second interview with a few more of you because we really need to make sure you're on board with what we're thinking church needs to be and how we need to play it out. Because you see, we had just had a really awful 3.5-year experience in a church where we thought we were on board and we got there and found out we weren't on board at all. And it was really tough for us. And we didn't want that again. And so they brought another bigger group of people together, and we met at Salisbury Christian School in the library, which is where Salisbury Community Church of the Brethren, now Community of Joy, was meeting at the time. And they had this guy who came on behalf of the district, but he wasn't a part of our denomination. He was a United Methodist. He was a former United Methodist pastor. And he came and he led the devotions that night, and he used this passage. And out of that night, that passage, the way he talked about this passage of the disciples fishing all night, and not catching anything. This congregation had been in existence for about 9 years at that point and had really struggled, had gathered about 28 people. And so it was small. It was a little smaller than we are now. And it was struggling to be in existence. And the district had said, we've got $84,000. We've got 3 years time, and you have to make it on your own at the end of that 3 years, or we're done. We can't do anymore. We can't fund you. We can't support you. We've done all we can do. It's really time for you guys to stand on your own. And so that was the task that we were faced with. And that was the piece out of this passage when the disciples fished all night and caught nothing, and they're fishermen. And then they encounter Jesus on the shore, and he says, throw your net on the other side, and they caught 153 fish. And so that piece of this passage is what convicted us, what the Holy Spirit used to convict Sharon and I, and to convict the team of people from here that we talked to, that let's come together and let's work at throwing the net on the other side. Let's do church in a different way than we might have been used to doing church. And, we've struggled with that throughout the time, throughout these 19 years, but we've been working at doing church. And we're not your typical church. You know that. And we do things a little differently. We throw the net on the other side of the boat sometimes. And it's beautiful. And so it's been a beautiful thing these 19 years for us to be here together and to be living out of this passage, in our life together. Now, there is much going on in this passage that we need to note. The primary emphasis is on Peter and his response to the resurrection of Jesus. And there's at least two ways that we can look at the response of Peter and what he's doing here when he announces that he's going fishing and the others want to go with him. And until last night, I had not thought much about the second way I'm going to talk about today. I had always read this, that Peter was disillusioned, that he was still trying to sort out and make sense in his head. What in the world is happening? I saw Jesus die. I saw him be put in the grave. I saw his empty grave. I saw him come back. I saw him in behind closed doors twice. And I'm Jesus did what dead people don't usually do. And that is he didn't stay dead. He came back to life. And that's, we know the end of the story, and it's hard to put ourselves in the mind frame that these early followers must have been in. But I can just imagine Peter was struggling with all of that. And then he was struggling with the disappointment of letting Jesus down. I mean, he declared vehemently that he would be there with Jesus. And yet Jesus said, "You'll deny me 3 times. And he did. And then there's the lack of direction and purpose. I mean, their leader was gone. What were they to do, and how were they to do it, and how would they go on? The confusion in trying to wrap his head around watching Jesus be killed and buried and then witnessing Jesus alive and back in 3 days. I get it. I get how easy it would be for Peter to go back to fishing. I mean, he was a fisherman to begin with. In times of difficulty and struggle in our lives, it's easy to slip back into the mode of what's familiar, what's comfortable. And that's always the way I've been looking at this. That's what Peter was doing. It's also easy to think that Peter might have needed to clear his head, to get away from the stress and confusion of the past several weeks. And so he went to a place where he could pray, where he could think. I can identify with that. One of the reasons that I like to work in the garden is it's a stress reliever. When you're there nurturing plants and nurturing the soil, you can pray and connect with God on a whole new level, and you can leave the cares of the world alone, even if other people are working with you in the garden. It's also one of the reasons why I like to go to the woods on a regular basis and hang in a tree. Because I can get away from the cares and the stresses and struggles of the world, and I can clear my head and I can focus on God and pray. And I can connect more deeply to God's mission for me and His presence in my life. Perhaps you're like that. Perhaps you have a place or a thing that you like to do regularly to get away and to connect and to deepen your connection with God. Perhaps that's what's going on here with Peter. He was confused. His head was clouded by all that had taken place. He was disappointed in himself for denying Jesus. So going fishing allowed him to clear his head and it allowed him to do something that he was comfortable with, that he knew, that he was familiar. Perhaps. And that's always the way I've looked at this prior to last night. When my friend and our friend Rob Rappold, out of the blue, posted on Facebook this understanding of this passage, and he's not a part of our online transformational circle. So, all week our online transformational circle's been working with this passage. He didn't know that we've been working with this passage. He didn't know that I would see this and work it into my sermon today. But Rob posted this comment on Facebook. He said other things too related to this, but this is the heart of what he said. He said, "I believe Peter was looking for Jesus in the very first place that he encountered Jesus." I was like, wow, I never thought of that. I mean, I see it now that he said it. And especially when I go back into Matthew 4 and I look at what Matthew tells us about it. Matthew says, one day as Jesus was walking along the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Well, John says in John 21, later Jesus appeared again to the disciples beside the Sea of Galilee. It's not just that he returned to fishing. It was the same spot. I never thought of that. One day as Jesus was walking along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, also called Peter, and Andrew, throwing a net into the water, for they fished for a living. And Jesus called out to them, "Come, follow me, and I will show you how to fish for people." And they left their nets immediately and followed him. Wow, that's a powerful possibility. So this thought that Peter returns to fishing in the hopes of reestablishing a connection with Jesus is a pretty powerful thought. Like being transported back in time to that place where you first made your commitment to Jesus. I don't know where that was for you. But for me, it was in my home church in Cordova, Maryland, Fairview Church of the Brethren. And every time I walk back in that church, and I haven't been back there for years, but every time I walk back in there, I'm transported back into 1976. It's amazing I can remember that long. Some of you weren't even born then. I was sitting on the back row with the youth, and Reverend Robert Alley was preaching a revival service. And for some reason at the end, when he did an altar call, I felt compelled to go down that aisle and make a commitment to declare that Jesus was my Lord and Savior, and that I would give my life to following him. And every time I walk back into that church, there I am. I have flashbacks of that moment. Maybe that's what's going on with Peter. Maybe he's going back to the Sea of Galilee and fishing because he's hoping to reconnect with Jesus. But we don't know. And we may never know. But what we do know is that whatever the reason Peter went fishing, thanks to John, we know what happened after he fished. They had fished all night long and had caught nothing. Nada. Zero. Zip. Nothing. Now that hurts an experienced fisherman's ego. Anybody like to go fishing and catch nothing? No. And most fishermen, if they don't catch anything, they tell you about something that they caught. You know, fishermen are known to say they caught a fish, oh, this big. Or that big fish bit and it got away. You know how that is. They had caught nothing. They had fished all night. They were experienced fishermen. And as day broke, they were tired and discouraged from a long, unproductive night. Someone standing on the shore calls out to them and asks them what they caught. And you know they didn't want to say nothing. You know they didn't. No fisherman wants to say nothing. Never. And yet, they did. He said, "What have you caught?" They don't know it's Jesus. And they don't know it's Jesus for a variety. I don't think you can make too much of this. We talked about this a little bit in our online discussion. I don't think you can say that Jesus' appearance changed and that's why they didn't recognize him. You know, it's early in the morning. They've been fishing all night. They're tired. You know, when you stay up all night, your eyes don't see clearly either. And in the low light of the day, they might not have seen. They were about 100 yards out. It's hard to be clear facial features from 100 yards. There's all kinds of reasons why they might not have known Jesus. They weren't expecting to see Jesus there. And so he calls out and he says, "Have you caught anything?" And they said, "No." And then he says, get this. He says, "Throw the net on the other side of the boat." Now, if you know anything about fishing with a net, they throw this net over and they drag it with the boat through the waters and it catches the fish. So they had just covered that whole Sea of Galilee all night long and they didn't catch nothing. And this dude on the shore, who they don't even know, says, throw the net on the other side and you'll catch fish. And so they do. And you can't make anything out about the fact that they're obedient to Jesus because they don't know it's Jesus at this point. So you can't go there in this case. And they catch, John tells us, 153 fish. Now, I don't know that there's anything significant about 153. He says 153 large fish. That's a lot of fish. In fact, he also says it was so many fish, they couldn't get the net in the boat. So they dragged the net alongside the boat into shore. 153 large fish. That in and of itself is a miracle. And every time Jesus produced a miracle, every time Jesus performed a miracle, people's eyes were open. And at that moment, John tells us that he said, "It's the Lord." That miracle opened their eyes. And as soon as he declared it was the Lord, there's Peter getting dressed to jump in the water to swim ashore to see him. Now, what's up with the getting dressed? Now, see, getting dressed to jump in the water. And you see, when in that day, they had an outer garment and an inner garment. And Peter had stripped down to the inner garment to leave his outer garment from getting dirty and slimy and fish smelly, because it's what he had to wear around. And so he took it off, but why he put it back on to jump in the water to swim up to see Jesus, I don't know. But it's Peter. Peter's the impetuous one. Peter does things that don't make sense sometimes. But as soon as John declared it's the Lord, Peter's gotten himself dressed and is in the water and swimming ashore. And then a beautiful thing happens as Jesus and Peter meet on the shore. There's Jesus. He's built a fire. He's frying some fish. He doesn't even need the fish, but he says to Peter, "Go get some of those fish you just caught, and then come, let's have breakfast." And so Peter is obedient at this point. He recognizes it's Jesus. There you can say he's obedient. He goes back to the boat and he drags the net all by himself. It's so big that all of them can't get it. It's so heavy that all of them can't get it on the boat. Yet here's Peter going back to the boat and pulling this net ashore from where the boat's docked out in the water and bringing it ashore. Because, the boat can't get all the way in because it'll get stuck. So he brings it in. And I don't know. Maybe Jesus gave him extra strength. Maybe just the fact that he knew it was Jesus and he was so excited and he had so much adrenaline. He pulled this net in. And then this beautiful thing happens between Jesus and Peter. Before we get there to that, let's go back and look at some background about this beautiful thing that's about to happen between Jesus and Peter. In John 13, right after Jesus has the Last Supper with with his disciples, Jesus washes their feet, and eats the meal and does the communion thing with them. And then this goes on. As soon as Judas left the room, Jesus said, "The time has come for the Son of Man to enter into his glory, and God will be glorified because of him. And since God receives glory because of the Son, he will soon give glory to the Son. Dear children, I will be with you only a little longer, and as I told the Jewish leaders, you will search for me, but you can't come where I'm going. So now I'm giving you a new commandment. Love each other just as I have loved you. You should love each other. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples." Now get this. Simon Peter asked, "Lord, where are you going?" And Jesus replied, "You can't go with me now, but you will follow me later." "But why can't I come now, Lord?" he asked. "I'm ready to die for you." And Jesus answered, "Die for me? I tell you the truth, Peter, before the rooster crows tomorrow morning, you will deny 3 times that you even know me." And then, just a little while later, that day, that night, we read in John 18, Simon Peter followed Jesus after he was arrested, as did the other disciples. As did another of the disciples. That other disciple was acquainted with the high priest, so he was allowed to enter the high priest's courtyard with Jesus. Peter had to stay outside the gate. Then the disciple who knew the high priest spoke to the woman watching the gate, and she let Peter in. The woman asked Peter, "You're not one of that man's disciples, are you?" "No," he said, "I am not." Because it was cold, the household servants and the guards had made a charcoal fire. They stood around it, warming themselves, and Peter stood with them, warming himself. Inside, the high priest began asking about Jesus' followers and what he had been teaching them. Jesus replied, "Everyone knows that I teach what I teach. I have preached regularly in the synagogues and the temple where the people gather. I have not spoken in secret. Why are you asking me this question? Ask those who heard me. They know what I said." Then one of the temple guards standing nearby slapped Jesus across the face. "Is that the way to answer the high priest?" he demanded. Jesus replied, "If I had said anything wrong, you must prove it. But if I'm speaking the truth, why are you beating me?" Then Annas bound Jesus and sent him to Caiaphas, the high priest. Meanwhile, as Simon Peter was standing by the fire, warming himself, he was standing by the fire. Get that? We'll talk about that. Warming himself, they asked him again, "You're not one of that guy's disciples, are you?" He denied it, saying, "No, I'm not." Then one of the household slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Didn't I see you out there in the olive grove with Jesus?" Again, Peter denied it, and immediately the rooster crowed 3 times. He denied Jesus 3 times, just as Jesus said before the rooster crowed. Now, when he denied Jesus, he was warming himself by the fire. Have you ever warmed yourself by the fire? What happens when you warm yourself by the fire? Do you smell yourself? You smell like smoke. You can't get away from it. You can't escape it. Everywhere you go, for days sometimes, if you wear those same clothes, you smell like smoke. Even after you shower sometimes, you smell like smoke if you've warmed yourself by the fire. I think that's an important piece here. Because Jesus and Peter are standing by a fire that Jesus built, and I can guarantee you that as Peter comes ashore and stands by the fire engaging Jesus, he's having flashbacks. Because he smells the smoke, and the smoke takes him back. It's amazing how that happens. And I think it's an intentional thing of Jesus to be there on the shore with Peter after fishing all night, that Jesus has a fire going, and the smell of that smoke transports Peter back to the time that he denied Jesus before this beautiful thing is about to happen. It's amazing how that happens in our lives. You know, my grandmother Grove has been dead for more than 25 years. And it's been even longer than that, that I was a boy staying at her house for 2 weeks every summer. And when we stayed at her house, it was back before the soft soap dispensers that you use, and she used ivory soap in the bar. It was ivory soap at every sink and ivory soap in every shower. And after you get out of the shower with ivory soap, you smell like ivory soap. You smell clean and fresh. And every time, even now, if I go into a store and I find a bar of ivory soap and I smell it, I'm transported back to my teenage years in my grandmother Grove's house. I think that very same thing is happening for Peter as he smells that smoke standing next to Jesus. He's realized who it is now. He's seen the miracle of the 153 fish, and he's having a flashback to what he had done just a few days before when he denied Jesus. And then this beautiful thing happens. Jesus says to Peter, "Peter, do you love me?" "Well, yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Then Jesus says, "Feed my sheep." A second time, Jesus says, "Peter, do you love me?" And Peter says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." "Then tend my lambs." A third time, Jesus says, "Peter, do you love me?" And this time, John tells us that Peter is sad. He's hurt. He's hurt that Jesus asked the third time, but I think it's intentional that he asked 3 times. Jesus is doing something very important here. And the third time, Peter says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus says, "Then take care of my lambs." Jesus, in this moment, is recommissioning Peter. And get the perspective that Rob gave us. Peter has gone back to where he was called, where he first encountered Jesus, and he's having a recommissioning at that very same spot by Jesus. Jesus is reinstating him. is recommissioning him, is saying, you know what? Yes, you denied me. Yes, you let me down. Yes, you got off track. But all that doesn't matter. Because it doesn't matter where you've been. It doesn't matter what you've done. You're never outside the reach of God's love and grace. And that's what Jesus is teaching Peter here. Despite losing his way, despite fearing for his life, despite abandoning ship and letting Jesus down, Peter is used by God in mighty ways. God works in and through Peter in huge, huge ways, carrying forth the mission of Jesus into the world. In fact, the Catholic Church looks at Peter as the first pope. He's that important. Peter comes as a leading disciple of Jesus, and he's responsible for the establishment of many, many churches and the spread of the mission of Jesus throughout the Jewish world and into the Gentile world. You see, God's love and grace is available to all of us, despite our failings. God works in and through us to fulfill his mission and ministry in the world. And just as Jesus wanted to make sure Peter knows, he also wants to make sure we know that our love for God is more than just a declaration. Jesus didn't just ask, Peter, do you love me? And Peter said, yes, I love you. And Jesus left it there. Jesus followed up by saying, then take care of my lambs. Then do something with the love you declare you have for me. Because it's easy to declare our love for Jesus. But if it doesn't make its way out in the way we live our lives, it's nothing. Jesus challenges Peter and us to turn our declaration of love into actions, to declare with our lives and our way of living that we love Jesus. Feeding lambs is about all of the ways we share the blessing of God with others, all of the ways we tangibly love others, looking beyond the mess to see the beloved that's in us and that's in each other. Inviting the broken to find healing and purpose with Jesus. God offers his grace to Peter and to each of us. And the question for us is, how do you respond? How do you respond to God's grace?